Following on from a micro update to Assetto Corsa Evo, there is a ray of hope, a glimmer of OG Kunos magic. The pizza oven, though not fully up to temperature, might have been cleared of the salty seawater. In this video, I'm going to talk about the micro update and why it's so significant, and I'm also going to explain the ginormous physics issue that's holding Evo back from being a truly great racing simulator, or a simulator that could beat out Kunos' original Assetto Corsa magic. If they can fix this, it's on. Subscribe to gain the power to be able to unsubscribe at a later date. Clicking the like button will improve not only your virtual but your real world force feedback. And sadly, many people have become members and financially supported this channel, making the internet worse and sim racers cry all around the world. Your support, like that of Sports Underwear, is greatly appreciated. Before I get into what is fundamentally missing in Evo and what needs to be addressed, let me first go over what I think has improved in the simulator since we last played it. And some really important, though rather boring things to consider when it comes to force feedback in racing simulators. Please bear with me. Now, whether or not this was the micro update or the fact that we hadn't driven some vehicles in the previous update and they had changed, I'm not 100% sure. But either way, what we found jumping into cars like this Caterham is that they drive a lot more naturally than they were previously, and the force feedback generally feels a lot less dampened, a lot more precise, and a lot more intuitive. Some of that could be car setup changes. There's not much you can change yourself with the setup of this car, but who knows if Kunos has changed some underlying features of this vehicle. Some of that could be changes to the amount of designed damper and force feedback of the vehicle on a technical level, and some of that could also be a result of tyre model changes or underlying physics changes. Of course, without looking at the source code, it's hard to know for sure what has caused what, for what reasons, and what is more or less significant. Now, it's really worth saying this because there's so much confusion around force feedback and physics in sim racing. You have to understand that force feedback is a result of multiple things coming together. It's a result of the physics and what the vehicle's actually doing, and then those physics driving the force feedback, and then whatever developer decisions are made in terms of how that force feedback is sent to the player's steering wheel, and then whatever settings the player has happened to put on their wheel. So there's a lot going into the force feedback soup that can absolutely ruin everything, be that on the user's side with the user setting their wheel up in funky ways, or the developer making choices in how the force feedback is generated and sent to the user, and then also the developer potentially messing up their underlying physics. And as an additional thing as well, car setup can also affect how the force feedback can feel in a racing simulator. So there's a lot that can be the cause of why a car feels a certain way on your end or the developer's end. So that's worth keeping in mind. Also, something that really people need to keep in mind is that force feedback cannot fix a racing simulator's underlying physics. It can, however, make a racing simulator a lot easier and more intuitive to drive, giving the player information and details to drive from. But conversely, it can also make a racing simulator a lot harder to drive by giving the player false information, or fundamentally making the steering and input of the vehicle harder, thus making it harder to actually control the car in the video game. So, with that not confusing at all information out of the way, I have to say some of the vehicles in Evo definitely feel a lot better now in the force feedback. You are noticing a lot more dynamic range coming through the simulator into your force feedback steering wheel. Of note, I play driving simulators when I'm testing them with a whole bunch of different settings, but generally what I'll do is I'll remove all filters from my wheel, all damper from the video game, and I'll try and set things up to get as raw as possible signal from the video game to my force feedback wheel, so I'm feeling what is actually coming out of the video game. Some people, and I've seen people post images of their wheel setups online, are playing these games with inertia, damper, God knows what settings on, which absolutely will mute and hide details from the simulator, which will massively affect how things feel to drive. Keep in mind that Evo, even with its update, still has what feels like quite a bit of built-in damper and rather muted force feedback. It's really not going to help you if you put a lot of damper on your wheel or even use the in-game damping. If I'm using a 21 Nm DD wheel with no damper on it and I can still feel that it's very dampened compared to other simulators, God knows how these other people are getting useful information from the sim. But, of course, some people might find the force feedback to be overactive with their settings, and in that scenario, using some damper can actually be useful. So I'm not saying damper's universally terrible, but keep in mind what I've said and how it will affect what you're feeling from the simulator. So all told, with the update, as I say, this Caterham seems to drive a lot more naturally now, and the force feedback is a lot more clear for you to then use that force feedback to actually handle the vehicle. And if you're going to be fair, I have to say this Caterham drives a million times better than the Caterham that's in Automobilista 2. And obviously compared to stuff like Gran Turismo 7, this is way more dynamic, way more interesting to handle, and has way richer and detailed force feedback. Same as if you were to compare this vehicle to other things, Forza and what have you. So in a general perspective of sim racing games, it's really quite good, and if you're coming from those other titles, you'd think this is absolutely fantastic. Also worth noting, compared to popular PC racing simulators like iRacing, Evo does not have iRacing's progressively turning off tyres with the grip not returning and snapping back quickly, which is a huge physics issue in iRacing that iRacers for some reason just gloss over and totally ignore, even though it totally defines how everything drives in that simulator. In Evo and ACC and the original Assetto Corsa, the grip returns quickly on the tyres, which is also what happens with real cars. Surprising really that you design tyres to grip the road. It's almost as if that's the point of a tyre. So it does those aspects really, really well, and actually think the return of grip and the sort of punchiness of the tyres in Evo is really quite nice. In some ways, actually, even an improvement over the original Assetto Corsa. And I'd also say what is an improvement over the original Assetto Corsa are the dynamics of the tyre when you are under the limit. And when you're approaching the limit, the variation in the tyre just seems a lot more dynamic than the original Assetto Corsa. So things like getting on the throttle and then getting push understeer from getting on the throttle, or the rotation of the vehicle and the tyre grip variation from how you're rotating the car, and a lot of subtle things I think are really nicely done and reflected with the tyres in Assetto Corsa Evo, specifically when you're under the limit. So there was some positivity to help brace you for the huge physics issue that Assetto Corsa Evo has, and what Kunos really need to address if they want this simulator to actually feel like you're driving a real car, and for it to beat out the original Assetto Corsa. And I'll be honest, this is my real worry with Evo, because Kunos never sorted this out with ACC, and I'm a little bit worried that Kunos don't even realise that this is a problem with the simulator. And the issue is, the vehicles don't want to stay or be in combined slip, or what is also known as a neutral steer state. It's when all four tyres are effectively at the limit and the car is in its sort of joyful state of poise and balance, which allows the driver to then rotate the car more through the corner or hold the car in optimal slip angles for the tyres. Evo actively fights you to push you back under the limit, or it goes abruptly over the limit into a passenger slide that does return quite quickly, unlike iRacing. So it's not that you're going to just bin the car. The grip comes back and it's not race over, but the car really does not want to stay in a neutral steer state, even if you are incredibly active at balancing the vehicle and incredibly astute at generally holding vehicles in a neutral state of slip. Now, I'm not saying that a car should be super duper easy to hold in neutral steer. I would even argue that the original Assetto Corsa is far too easy to hold the car in neutral steer state. But at the same time, it shouldn't be the most finicky, ridiculous, unhinged thing known to man. It should actually be a relatively happy state for a car to be in if you're in optimal conditions, brand new tyres, neutral car setup. You know, if you've got like 10,000 hours of sim racing experience and are within a second or two of pace in most simulators, you really shouldn't be that difficult to do, or it shouldn't be that much of a chore to try and get the car to stay at the limit. And what you'll notice with Evo is that the slick tyres really magnify this tendency for Evo to want to push you back under the limit or hold you in a passenger slide that you have to wait out to finish before the grip returns so you can continue driving. It really does not want to stay in a balanced state, and that is what makes it a real chore to drive if you are a moderately skilled sim racer or moderately skilled rear-wheel driver that looks to hold a car in neutral steer through a corner and then try to do that with the better braking point, with the racing line, getting on the power correctly and everything. This is the reason why Evo and ACC, which has the same issue that they're never fixed, this is why, if you're a good driver, it is a chore to drive. And it's inherent to all the vehicles in the simulator. The slick tyres and a lighter car like the F2004 or even the Porsche Cup make this behaviour more obvious because a slick tyre is more abrupt and to the point, and an F2004 is lighter and more abrupt and to the point. So it makes it more obvious. But if you pay attention, the same behaviour is even there in the road cars or cars like the Caterham. It's just that it's harder to detect because they're generally sloppier vehicles, and when you've gone well over the limit, they're much more controllable. So the fact that it's gone past the actual neutral steer balanced slip state doesn't feel as if it's too much of an issue because you've just gone into larger oversteer and it'll come back no problem. But the slick tyres really make it obvious what's missing. And I think what's happening with Evo is that what you'll find is drivers that are not that talented at holding neutral slip or don't even know it exists, they gravitate towards this behaviour because they're basically driving under the limit all the time for the most part, and then the sim is basically pushing them back under the limit, making things very easy to drive if you are driving under the limit. So for them it's like, oh, this is great, I'm not really ever spinning, I feel really in control of the vehicle. As I say, it feels really nice and dynamic under the limit, so they're like, oh, I can feel so much through the force feedback. But if you're a driver that's a moderately talented race driver in a simulator or in real life, you will try to get the car into neutral steer as soon as possible. All the stuff under the limit is effectively irrelevant because you're only ever really trying to drive at the limit, on the limit, balancing at the limit. And that is why those drivers immediately, when they play Evo, even following the latest update, immediately within 5 or 6 corners will be like, yeah, this is terrible still, just like ACC, what are you doing, Kunos? So unless they can sort that behaviour in neutral steer out, the pizza will never be cooked, just like ACC's pizza was never cooked. And I do think the difficulty is ACC and Evo clearly have a very complicated tyre model, which makes it much harder to dial in that neutral steer state and make that neutral steer state operate consistently with all vehicles. Whereas with Automobilista 1, and maybe with the original Assetto and older simulators, someone could basically massage a vehicle to have that neutral steer state. Even if it was over the top, even if it wasn't the most natural and a little bit cheesy, at least it could be achieved, and then drivers that know how to drive at the limit could indeed drive naturally. For people that are still with us in this video, I'm going to have to say this because this often gets brought up when we talk about this subject. Rolling into slip and doing effectively a power slide from the momentum that you've gained going into the corner, and then turning the steering wheel to stop the rear end from spinning around or losing the car, that is not neutral steer or balancing slip. That is a totally valid way to drive and a very fast way to drive, possibly even the fastest way to drive. However, it is not the only way to drive and can't be used in all situations and shouldn't be used in all situations. So that is another aspect that then muddies the water on this whole thing and confuses people when it comes to neutral steer and driving in balanced slip. But there you go. I've put it out there. I've put it on the table. I've explained what Kunos need to have sorted in this simulator for it to beat out the original AC. And I am a little bit optimistic, following on from the last update, that maybe Kunos could get there. I do really love some of the graphics in this game. I do really love some aspects of the handling of the cars in this game. And I am really enjoying that there's a lot more detail to be felt in the force feedback following on from the last update. James reporting for Gamer Muscle. Happy tea drinking, take care, and goodbye.